Growing up, I always knew I was the extra in my family, but the full reality didn't hit until I turned 16. That's when my parents and my twin sister Lucy decided I didn't have a place in our tiny home anymore. Now, at 28, I'm finally stable, I've got my own place, and Lucy's back, uninvited, this time with her husband and kids asking to move in. You can imagine the rage that started boiling up. From the beginning, it was always about Lucy. I was just the tag-along, something they had to deal with because I happened to arrive alongside the golden child they wanted. My parents outright told me that if it had been only me, they wouldn't have gone through with the pregnancy. They felt they had no choice but to bring me into the world since Lucy came along too. Not the best way to find out you owe your life to someone else's sheer luck. Lucy rubbed it in constantly. She wasn't just spoiled. She believed she deserved everything simply for existing. Every new toy, every extra set of clothes, all of it went to her. Meanwhile, I was lucky if I got one new shirt at Christmas and another on our birthday. And if we didn't share the same birthday, I'm pretty sure my parents wouldn't have bothered to celebrate it at all. The only bright spot in my childhood was my grandfather. He was the one person who could see through their favoritism and who'd call out the nonsense. But he passed away when I was 13, and after that, it felt like I'd lost the only shield I had. The next few years, I just tried to keep my head down, focus on getting through school, and hope for 18 so I could finally leave. But I didn't even make it that long. When Lucy and I were 16, she got pregnant by some guy named Matt, who was 19 and had been kicked out of his own home for flunking the 8th grade, multiple times. My parents were horrified. But instead of setting boundaries, they doubled down on protecting her, even letting Matt move in with us. And that apparently meant I had to go. At first, I asked if I could at least sleep on the couch. I mean, it was a small house, and I was just a kid. I didn't know where else to go. But my dad shot that idea down, saying he needed the couch himself whenever he couldn't handle my mom's snoring. So I was told, with no room left for me, I'd have to find somewhere else to stay. I asked if I could maybe stay with relatives, but they made it clear I was not to embarrass them by reaching out to family. Desperate, I tried a few friends, but who's going to let a teenager live with them when his own parents had kicked him out? Finally, a classmate offered me a spot in his family's garage. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over my head for a few weeks, until his parents caught on and kicked me out too. That was how I ended up on a bench, sleeping in parks for days, until the police found me. When they brought me back home, my parents lied and said I'd run away. That night, they got me a tent from a junkyard and told me to set it up in the backyard. It was a reward, they said, for not embarrassing them in front of the police. At the time, I took what I could get, but that first winter in the tent nearly killed me. One night, after shivering for hours, I tried knocking on the back door, begging to sleep on the floor inside. My dad just shouted at me to get lost and not bother them. Standing out there in the cold, it hit me that if I stayed, I wouldn't survive. The next day, I looked for work and found a job in a bakery nearly 20 miles away. They needed someone to help out and clean up the bakery area, and in exchange, they'd let me stay in a shed behind their shop. It was rough, and the place was crawling with rodents, but at least it was somewhere I could sleep, and they even fed me. I packed my things and left without a word to my family. My sister's parting words? Good. That was the beginning of my life on my own, but it wouldn't be the last time Lucy or my parents found a way to remind me that I was, in their eyes, just an afterthought. The next few years were a blur of grinding, hustling, and trying to survive. The bakery job was rough, but I was grateful to have it. I stayed in that shed for almost a year, scrubbing flour off the floors and doing whatever needed to be done to earn my keep. Every day I woke up, worked, cleaned, and did it all over again. Sometimes I'd see families coming in for pastries, chatting and laughing, completely oblivious to how good they had it. It was like looking into another world, a world I'd never belonged to. But I kept pushing. Eventually, I decided I needed to learn more, to pick up skills that would get me out of this hole. I'd helped my dad with basic repairs around the house, and while that was far from a good memory, it gave me an idea. I started teaching myself basic mechanics whenever I had a spare moment. I saved every bit I could from my bakery job, eventually scraping together enough to take a course in auto repair. It was tough balancing the class with work, but I'd reached the point where nothing could stop me. I'd survived the backyard tent in winter, I'd survived sleeping on the streets. There was no way I'd let a few late nights and long days break me now. After I finished my course, I got an entry-level job at a car plant. It didn't pay much, and I was still barely getting by, but I was climbing. Slowly, step by step, I was moving up. And by the time I hit my mid-20s, I'd worked my way up to a supervisor role. Life wasn't exactly easy, but at least I was stable. I rented a tiny, rundown apartment in a sketchy part of town, but it was mine, and that mattered more than anything. A couple of months ago, out of the blue, one of my old friends from high school reached out. He was going through a rough divorce and needed to sell his house quickly. I wasn't exactly looking to buy a home, and honestly, I wasn't even sure I could afford one, but he offered me a good price. It was a 3-bedroom place, way more than I needed, and he was willing to work out a payment plan. I thought about it for a while, running the numbers, going over my savings. It was a stretch, but in the end, I decided to go for it. After everything I'd been through, having my own home felt like the final piece of the puzzle. I moved in just 2 weeks ago. The place wasn't fancy, but it felt like a palace compared to the shed I'd started in. For the first time, I had space, freedom, and a place that was truly mine. But then, this morning, just as I was starting to settle in, I got a surprise visit. I was barely awake when I heard the knock. Opening the door, I was greeted by my parents, Lucy, her husband Tom, and their 3 kids, all smiles like they were dropping by for a casual family reunion. It had been years since I'd seen them, and in all that time, they hadn't once reached out. Now here they were, acting like nothing had ever happened. They pushed their way inside before I could even get a word out. My mom and dad were walking around, nodding in approval, and Lucy was already poking her head into rooms, chattering about how nice the house was. It felt surreal, like some sort of twisted family get-together where I was the only one who remembered the past. I kept asking them why they were here, but they just kept dodging, brushing it off like they'd just come to check on me. Yeah, right. Then came the updates. Apparently my dad's health was declining. Lucy's 3 kids were growing up fast, and oh, she was pregnant again. They talked like they were catching up with an old friend, while I just stood there nodding, still trying to wrap my head around their sudden reappearance. Finally, Lucy wandered back into the living room and declared, "I've decided we're going to take that bedroom with the balcony. Tom and I can have our own bathroom, and the kids can have the other room. It'll be perfect." I just stared at her, trying to figure out if she was joking. But no, she was dead serious. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You quote V got a 3-bedroom house and you're a single guy," she said, as if that justified her whole plan. "You don't need all this space. You lived in a tent once. This is a huge upgrade for you." I couldn't hold it in anymore. I asked them point blank if they'd lost their minds, thinking they could just show up and move in. That's when my mom chimed in, suggesting I be more considerate. Apparently, Lucy's house was getting cramped, with the kids sharing beds and sleeping on couches, and my parents thought it was only fair for me to help out. That's when it all came flooding back. The years I spent in that backyard tent, the endless nights on the street, the way they'd thrown me out like I was nothing. And now they were here, acting like I owed them something, like I'd somehow wronged them by having a house of my own. Before I knew it, I was yelling. All the anger, all the resentment I'd buried over the years just came pouring out. I told them exactly what I thought of them, how they'd failed me, how they'd abandoned me when I was just a kid. My dad tried to raise his voice, pulling the whole "I'm your father" routine, but I didn't let him get a word in. I told him that I didn't owe them anything, and if they thought otherwise, they were delusional. Lucy's husband, Tom, tried to step in, telling me to man up and let them stay. I could barely contain my rage. I told them all to get out and never come back. My mom started crying, reaching out to hug me, but I stepped back. I was done. As they filed out, still grumbling, I felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time in my life, I'd stood up to them. And as the door closed behind them, I felt like I'd finally slammed it shut on my past, too. After that showdown, I thought they'd finally leave me alone. I'd made my position clear, and if they had any decency, I figured they'd respect it and keep their distance. But as usual, they didn't care about boundaries, especially when they thought they could take something from me. A week passed in peace, and I started to relax, thinking maybe they'd finally understood. Then one morning I heard a knock. I opened the door, and there was my mom, standing alone on my front porch with that same forced smile. "Hi, honey," she said, all sweet and friendly like nothing had happened. "I just wanted to talk. No hard feelings. Can I come in?" I leaned against the door frame, blocking her from coming in, and asked her to get to the point. She tried to make small talk, asking about work, asking if I'd been eating well, but I wasn't falling for it. Finally, she sighed and dropped the act. "Look, it's been really hard on us, your dad and me," she started, her voice dropping to a pitiful tone. "You know he's getting older. He can't work as much as he used to, and we haven't been able to keep up with repairs on the house. Things are falling apart. I could see where this was going, but I let her keep talking. We're barely getting by, and Lucy's kids are getting bigger," she said, starting to tear up. "The house is just too small, and your dad and I, well, we thought maybe we could move in here. We could give Lucy our place. It's smaller, and we know she'd be grateful to have it. There it was. They wanted me to give up my home, the one I'd worked so hard to get, so they could hand their place over to Lucy and her family. I stared at her in disbelief. She must have sensed I wasn't buying it because she switched tactics again. "Lucy even said she'd pay rent to help with your mortgage," she said, as if that was some great favor. I almost laughed. Lucy could barely make ends meet with her freeloading husband, and now my parents thought she'd actually help me pay for the house? I told my mom flat out that I didn't want Lucy's rent, and I didn't need her to help me with anything. I reminded her that I'd built my life on my own, without a single handout from any of them, and I sure didn't need them now. But my mom wouldn't give up. She kept talking about how hard things were for Lucy, how she barely had a moment's peace with 3 kids and another on the way, and how she was so tired from juggling everything on her own. She said Lucy's house was cramped and uncomfortable, and she didn't even have her own bedroom. It was all so familiar, the same guilt-tripping, the same manipulation. I kept my face blank, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. "That's not my problem," I said, keeping my voice steady. "She chose that life. Nobody forced her to have 4 kids she can't afford. My mom's face twisted in frustration, and for a second I saw the mask slip. She couldn't hide her anger at me standing my ground, just like when I was a kid. I wasn't caving, wasn't letting her control me, and she hated it. "If you won't take in your sister," she said, her voice tight, "at least let us stay here. Your father is old. He needs a place where he can rest without worrying about fixing things all the time. You're still young, and this house is too big for just one person. You don't even have a girlfriend, do you?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were just piling on, using every excuse in the book to try to guilt me into saying yes. And for a split second I thought about all those years I'd spent in that tent, in that shed, on the street, all because they wanted me gone. And now here they were, expecting me to play the responsible son for parents who'd thrown me out like trash. I didn't raise my voice, didn't even let myself get worked up. I just looked her dead in the eye and said, "Karma is real. Remember how you kicked me out at 16? Well, this is what you get in return. I'm not your backup plan, and I'm not a safety net for you or Lucy. This is my house and nobody's moving in. Now please leave. Her face fell, and I could see the shock in her eyes. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. After a few seconds, she seemed to realize that I was serious. She looked away, muttered something under her breath, and finally walked out. As I closed the door behind her, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. There was a part of me that wished things could have been different, that maybe they'd changed over the years. But seeing her today, hearing her excuses, I realized they'd never cared about me the way they cared about Lucy, and they never would. I spent the rest of the day trying to push it out of my mind, but a feeling of dread settled over me. Part of me knew they wouldn't let it go so easily. My family had never respected my boundaries, not when I was a kid, and certainly not now. And sure enough, it wouldn't be long before they tried something even more desperate to worm their way back into my life. A few days after my mom's visit, one of my neighbors, Mr. Jones, an old man who spends most of his afternoons on his front porch, stopped by. He seemed a bit uneasy, like he wasn't sure if he should say anything. But finally, he told me he'd seen something strange around my house the day before. Apparently, a woman, pregnant with a man and a young boy, had been lurking around my backyard, peeking in the windows and walking around the property. Mr. Jones said he watched them from his porch, and when they noticed him staring, they left in a hurry. It didn't take a genius to figure out who it was. I thanked him, gave him my number, and asked him to call me if he saw them again. And that weekend, I went out and bought a security camera system. I wanted to get it set up as soon as possible, but life had other plans. Just 2 days later, I got a call from Mr. Jones telling me he suspected someone had broken into my house. My heart dropped. I rushed home, barely stopping for traffic lights, and when I got there, my worst fears were confirmed. My back window was shattered, and there, in my living room, were Lucy, her husband Tom, and their kids, standing around like they owned the place. Lucy saw me and barely even blinks. She just shrugged and said, "We didn't have any other options. You were being such a jerk, not letting us stay here, so we're staying anyway, . For a moment, I was too shocked to respond. The audacity, the sheer nerve, it was almost laughable. But then Tom strolled out of the bedroom with a smug grin, casually saying, "Pretty smooth, huh?" Something snapped in me. Without thinking, I charged at Tom, ready to knock that grin right off his face. Lucy tried to get between us, but I pushed her aside. And then Tom's oldest kid, barely a teenager, picked up a glass bottle and swung it at my head. The blow wasn't enough to knock me out, but I felt blood trickling down my face as I staggered back. My vision blurred, but pure rage kept me going. As they saw the blood, panic spread across their faces. Lucy fumbled with her phone, calling our parents and frantically telling them what was happening. Meanwhile, Tom and his son were scrambling to clean up the mess, muttering about how they hadn't meant for it to go this far. That's when Mr. Jones called the cops. Bless him. My parents arrived just as the police did, and what followed was the most twisted display I'd ever seen. Lucy, in full damage control mode, immediately started spinning lies, claiming they'd just come over for a friendly visit and that her son had accidentally hit me while playing a prank. My parents jumped right in, backing her up, insisting that I was blowing things out of proportion, that I was just angry and holding a grudge against my sister. For a second, I thought they might actually get away with it. But then Mr. Jones stepped in. He told the cops exactly what he'd seen, how they'd been lurking around the house, how they'd broken in. The officers weren't having it, and before I knew it, Lucy and Tom were in handcuffs, with their son being taken in for questioning. My parents were in shock, begging me to drop the charges and think of the family, but I was done thinking about them. They'd never thought about me. The next few days were a blur of police reports, doctor visits to treat my head injury, and meetings with lawyers. I decided to press charges, not just for breaking and entering, but also for assault. I'd had enough of their games, enough of being the family doormat. Lucy and Tom were fined heavily, and while they managed to get part of it traded off for community service, they still had to pay compensation for my lost wages and medical bills. Even their son faced consequences under juvenile law, spending a week in a youth facility and adding another layer of mess to their lives. The whole ordeal was exhausting, but for once I felt like I truly stood up for myself. I didn't back down. I didn't let them get away with their entitled nonsense. And after all was said and done, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, they'd finally leave me alone. For a brief, blissful stretch, things were quiet. I focused on work, patched things up around the house, and started thinking maybe the worst was behind me. But of course, my family had one last card to play. About a week after the court settled the case with Lucy and Tom, there was another knock at my door. When I looked out the window and saw my parents, I felt a knot in my stomach. I knew better than to open it, but part of me wanted closure, wanted them to finally understand that I was serious about keeping them out of my life. So, against my better judgment, I let them in. They shuffled in, looking defeated. For a minute, I thought maybe they were here to apologize, to finally admit to everything they'd put me through. My mom started crying, saying how hard things had been since I'd left, how they'd made mistakes. But the moment she mentioned Lucy, I realized this wasn't about me at all. It was another scheme. My dad started in, talking about how he couldn't work like he used to, how he was getting older and was feeling the weight of all those years in the factory. Their house, he explained, was in bad shape, with no money to fix it up. He paused, looking at me with an expectant gaze, like I should jump in and save the day. I stood there, silent, letting him finish. Finally, he got to the point. "We were thinking," he said. "You're our only son. It's your responsibility to take care of your family. It would be a comfort to know we're with you as we get older. They wanted to move in with me. And here was the kicker. They planned to give their house to Lucy so that her growing family could have space. They expected me to not only support them but also free them up to support my sister, who'd already leeched off them for years." I shook my head, letting out a bitter laugh. "So, let me get this straight. You want to hand over your house to Lucy and move in here with me?" My mom nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We're your parents. After everything, don't you think we deserve a little peace?" The rage bubbled up again, but this time I kept it in check. I was exhausted, sick of the endless guilt trips and schemes. "You want peace?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "How about the peace you gave me when you kicked me out at 16, or the peace I found sleeping in parks and alleyways because my own family turned me away?" My dad looked down, refusing to meet my eyes, but my mom's expression hardened. "We made mistakes," she muttered, "but that was a long time ago. You can't keep holding it against us forever." I took a deep breath. "You're right. I've held on to it long enough, and I'm done with it. I'm done with all of you. I've built this life from nothing with no help from any of you, and I'm not letting you drag me down again. This house, this life, this is my peace. She started to say something, but I opened the door and gestured for them to leave. "I'm done. If you need somewhere to stay, you have each other. You have Lucy. You don't have me. They looked at me in stunned silence, and after a few seconds they walked out, not saying another word. I watched them go, closing the door behind them and finally feeling that chapter of my life close too. It's been quiet since then. I haven't heard a peep from any of them, and I hope it stays that way. There's a strange relief in being alone, in knowing that no one can hurt me like that again. I've spent years clawing my way up from rock bottom, and now, for the first time, I feel like I'm finally free. This house might not mean much to anyone else, but to me, it's a symbol of everything I've overcome, every hardship I've faced alone. It's my proof that I survived, that I made it out on my own terms. Looking back, I realize I owed myself this peace a long time ago. I just had to find the strength to take it.